Hello and welcome to this virtual event with Demos and BT. It usually takes a few moments for everybody to tick through the system, so I'm just going to hang on a moment before introducing the event. But for those who are joining us, thank you for being with us today. It's quite exciting watching the numbers of participants tick up. You never know when it's going to stop. It's like a not very high stakes lottery. Perhaps just for people like me. Hello there, I'm Polly Mackenzie. I'm the Chief Executive of Demos, and we are delighted to be partnering today with BT on this event looking at technology and the responsible use of technology. We're going to be presenting the findings from some research that we at Demos conducted with BT's support using a fascinating pioneering piece of software called Polis, which allows you to map public opinion and also source new ideas from the public, which you can then test. So it's a fascinating way of identifying and also building consensus on public policy matters, which is something that is enormously important to us at Demos. We are a cross-party think tank working to involve the public in policy discussions and ensure that the country comes together to find consensus on difficult issues that confront us in this age of fast and accelerating change. So we were delighted to partner with BT. What we've got for you today is a presentation of the research by our Chief Technology Officer, Josh Smith. And then we're joined by a brilliant panel of thinkers and business people to explore the reality of our experience of technology, both through the pandemic and moving forward, to work out how do we ensure public consensus and trust in the technology that we are using, both to improve but also just transform people's lives. So the panel we've got with us today includes Adrian Joseph, who has an OBE awarded for his role in increasing equality and diversity in business. He's the Managing Director of Group AI and Data Solutions at BT, and also on the UK AI Council. We're also joined by Dr. Miley Zameter, who is at the Open Data Institute, Head of Public Policy, and Sabira Papain, who's Head of Equality, Health Inequalities and Digital Inclusion at NHSX. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Josh to take you through the findings of our research.
Good morning, everyone. So the COVID pandemic has really changed the way that lots of us experience and use and think about our use of technology. It's highlighted kind of new possibilities, but also really raised to the fore some of the existing divisions in how people were able to access and apply technology to their lives. Those who have tended to have recourse to resources of, space to work in and the tech to connect them to people have been able to use them. Those who have not are at danger of being left behind. And we've been reminded both not only of how tech can help us tackle public health problems, but also how it can perpetuate discrimination and marginalization. So this raises a really crucial question, which is how those regulating and designing technology can ensure that it both takes these effects into account and develops responsibly, but also responds to the way that the public actually perceive the harms that of their use of technology, the way that they want their data to be used. At the beginning of this year, Demos worked with BT to conduct a conversation with a nationally representative sample of the public. We involved more than 1,000 people from around the UK, and we conducted this on the tool Polis. And rather than talk to you about Polis or even demonstrate it, I'm delighted to say that we are running a conversation of this type live at the moment, which you can access. And I think there should be a link to that in the chat. So Polis does two things really well. Firstly, when you log in, you will be presented with a stack of statements. And these are 4 statements. We've seeded this conversation with 4 statements that we put to the public. For example, I'm concerned that the increased use of technologies. I'm just going to share my screen here so you can see what I am seeing. Share. Talk about use of technology. For example, this idea that people are concerned with the increased use of technologies to track me in public spaces. I actually agree with this statement, at the risk of influencing other people's votes. As soon as you agree, disagree, or pass with the statement, you are shown a new one. But crucially, you are allowed at any point, you're encouraged indeed to share your own perspective on these issues. So, you know, we encourage you to put your hottest data take in here. Once those are submitted, they will go to our team of moderators, and those moderated into the discussion are immediately then shown back to other participants. So this is the first really crucial part of this technology, and it's why Demos has been using it for the last couple of years, is that it's not just a poll, you're not just presented with statements decided by committee, you are able to bring your own perspectives to the discussion. We are going to be adding to these stack of statements based on points made by our panelists during the event, and please do log in and let us know what you think, whether you agree, whether you disagree. Share your own perspective on these conversations. The other thing that Polis, well, we found, sorry, that when we ran this discussion, the statements that we saw submitted really focused around 5 themes of responsible data. People wanted to talk about healthcare and their use of data by the government and the NHS, their custodianship of data, surveillance, the empowerment of users, and regulation. And these are some examples of statements that we had submitted to this system as we ran our 1,000 participant poll. So the second thing that Polis is really good at is surfacing areas of consensus and division. And what you're looking at here is a graph of the public participants who took the poll, and you'll see that Polis has divided them, and it uses a kind of machine learning approach to do this, based on similarities in their voting records. If you vote similarly to another participant, you're likely to end up in the same group. And as well as researchers, as well as this being a really good source of information for researchers, participants can see where there is majority opinion, where there is consensus between these groups, but also what divides them. And here, for example, we're looking at a statement saying that I'm happy for companies to sell my personal data. Most people disagree with this statement, although you can see Group A is more likely to agree with it. When we looked at the voting records of these groups, we found that people could be divided essentially according to their attitudes towards the future of technology, whether they saw the benefits, a high or low benefit for their data use, and how they perceive the risks of this data being used by technology providers and being regulated by regulators in the government. So on the left, we have a group that we've called the nonchalant, a fairly small group, who perceive fairly low risks in use of data, but see fairly high benefits. They were really highlighted to us that they saw the benefits of their data being used in healthcare. They weren't particularly keen on targeted advertising, but they tended to be fairly positive about use of data. Up here on the right, on the other end of the risk spectrum, we see the conflicted. And the conflicted were interesting because they both told us that they saw, again, the benefits of using data, especially in public health, but they really wanted more clarity on how their data was going to be used to provide those benefits. They were really strongly in favor of being in control of how people could use their data, and they saw a fairly high risk about misuse here. Interestingly, this group was much more likely to be female, much more likely to be under 34 and from an ethnic minority background than the rest of our participants, whereas Group C was much more likely to be male. Finally, we've got in the bottom right, the concerned. So these people see a huge amount of risk in their use of data, And they really don't see a benefit in commercial health, public safety uses. They don't see these reasons as outweighing the risks posed to them by data. This group tended to be older than the rest of the participants. So this gives us some insight into kind of where, I guess, the perspectives of our respondents sit. We've highlighted some areas of division within these groups already, and time and respect for our panel is going to stop me from going into a huge amount of detail here, but we lay out in great detail where these areas of division are on specific statements in our reports. But very briefly, we saw these groups had a very different relationship with technology. So the conflicted were much more likely to say they spent too much time on their devices and they didn't feel in control of the way that their data was being used. Whereas the nonchalant were much more likely to say, well, it doesn't really matter, it doesn't bother me that I'm spending too much time on my phones. The people were divided around terms and conditions, the risks of surveillance, whether they wanted the police to use their data to improve public safety, the way their data was used to improve health, and also by commerce. As well as division, though, we saw some strong areas of consensus. So people were united in a wish to be in control of their data, to have personal agency over how that data is used. And interestingly, we saw this really strong trend towards inclusion across all of our groups, this realization that there was a danger that kind of increasing ability of technology to change people's lives was at risk of leaving people behind who did not have access to that technology, who are excluded from those conversations. At this point, there's a really key question that I think we need to address. What does this actually tell us about how we might regulate for and design data responsibly in the future? So we came up with 3 key areas of kind of recommendation here. Firstly, we think that responsible data use needs to be specific and it needs to be limited. And this is partially a task for regulators. So regulators need to continue to make sure that sensitive areas of data are protected at levels that perhaps kind of standard data use isn't. But this is also a really clear opportunity and actually an obligation, we think, on private companies to tell people how they are using their data, to be really clear on how they're protecting personal data and how they are ensuring that that data is used responsibly. Secondly, we think companies should enable users to control that data and to have meaningful control over that data. But a really clear signal from our polling was that transparency was great, but it's not enough. You need to give people the ability to tell you how they want their data to be managed and then to act on that choice. Finally, and again, we saw this clearly across our divided groups, technology needs to be inclusive, it needs to be empowering. The non-discrimination should be a fundamental principle for the design of how you use people's personal data and how we regulate the use of personal data. And that it's crucial that, as said, in this era of technological change, people who don't already have access to that are not left behind. And the tools that are being built off the backs of the data of everybody should benefit everybody and not just those who can afford to use those technologies and to access those services. So that's it. As said, more detail in our reports, but I'm going to pass this back now to the panel. All I will say is do log in to that polis. We need your hot takes. We need your maths jokes. We need statements for people to vote on.
Thank you, Josh. I'm now going to turn to our panel for responses and thoughts more broadly about these challenging questions of how we maximize the benefits from people's data, but also maximize privacy, control, and inclusion. So the first person I'm going to ask to give her reflections is Shabira Papain from NHSX. You will know, the questions of health data have been in the news in the last few days with relation to our GP data. It's clear this is an area where there's very high sensitivity, but also, extraordinary potential from the data asset which the UK has with our basically unique form of healthcare funding. So for reflections on that, I'm going to turn to Shabira. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. That was very interesting. The first thing I will say is I act as an advisor and a contractor, and I go into different settings to support organisations. So I'm not here representing NHSX views. I work as a consultant to go into organisations. But actually, Polly, that was a really good start thinking about data in the news. And so I lead a network, it's called the People's Network. And it's about how we create democracy to access of digital, because digital has the potential to democratize access. In this case, we're talking about data, but it could be about health literacy or it could be about education. So there is a potential there, but the potential can be, the underpinning of that potential is founded on some of the principles that Josh has just taken us through around inclusive technology. And I mean, we could talk all day about what that actually means and how you actually deliver something that's inclusive and empowering. I think they're big words that we throw around, but I think they need to be really unpicked and unpacked, because what you and I might mean by inclusive might not be. So I guess my initial thoughts is that the data that you've shown through the poll corroborates a lot of what I hear in the work that I do for different organisations, and most importantly for the communities that we serve. What I would say is, I think when we're talking about something like this, particularly if you look at what's going on right now because of the big, crunching data that we want to be able to do with GP records, and how lots of communities have responded to that. And if they don't have access to be able to go and opt out, that's problematic. That, it talks about democracy of access now, of our own personal data. I think it's easy for us to depersonalize and to see data as this big thing. And I really love data, but this is people's lives. So we need to remember we're talking about real people's lives. This is life and death in lots of cases the pandemic has shown us. And so I think we need to, what I would steer us towards if we were to build on this research, because it's a small sample of, over about 1,000 people, is I think we need to, as well as having a representative sample, I think we need to turn it upside down, and we need to have an unrepresentative sample of those communities who are most at risk of the exclusion. So we need to look at this through the lens of communities who experience racism, of communities who experience poverty, of communities who have unstable housing, because all these factors, there's social determinants of our lives and social determinants of health, like housing, discrimination, employment, education, now digital exclusion, they have an impact on how we make these decisions. And if we can start to see it through their lens and increase the parameters that you had for your, what's dividing us, relationship with technology, terms and conditions, data to improve health, those things actually, you need to go a layer underneath. And we do need to look at those communities are most excluded because of intersectionality, because that's where we're going to find the data, going back to it, like people's views, people's living experiences that are going to inform what the conversation needs to be, so that we can make informed choices about, well, actually, yes, I feel like this, like this, like this, yes, I feel personally like this about the vaccine, for example. That's a really good one to think about. But actually my responsibility, to my community or socially. And so it's always weighing out my personal individual need versus the community and society I live in. And we need to make a decision in there. But if we're not getting really good quality conversations, and instead we're getting lots of misinformation, and that's coming nice and readily, and it's really easily available, and the stuff that we have in our academic landscape, as professionals, we can interrogate it, but the people on the ground can't, then we're going to keep having this conversation in 10 years. And the conversation's not shifted as far as I hoped that it would be. At least now, for me, we're talking about exclusion and we are talking about intersectionality. So this is all really good conversations, but we need to be able to distill it. We need to take it from us as experts and bring it to people on the ground. It needs to be simple and precise, but it needs to be connected with what they're really worried about. You need to put me on.
That's fantastic. I've got lots of questions, but I'm not going to jump in with them. People who are watching or participating on Polis, if you've got a really great statement that you've posted on Polis, do feel free to also put it into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen so that we can start planning our questions, which we're going to ask to this fantastic panel. So the next person I'm going to ask to speak is Adrian Joseph. I introduced him before from BT, a real AI expert. Adrian, what do you make of these challenging issues?
So thank you, Shabir and Polly. And I mean, so much of what Shabir said, I would, absolutely endorse. I mean, my starting point is really around us as consumers, right? And you and I make 35,000 decisions every day. 35,000, 200 just on food. Apparently, Cornell University tell us. We've got used to one click, one touch lives. Our mobile is at the heart of a lot of things that we're doing. And if you look at the amount of data that is used by our mobile devices, it's increased 20x since 2011, 20x times the use of data just in our mobile devices. And so we live in a world where I believe everything will be measured, that everything from being able to take a picture of you all right now on this screen and pull an API from one of the big cloud providers, and it'll give me an index of your emotional state along a number of dimensions. And we've seen this used in some healthcare applications. So Babylon Health, for example, that uses a lot of artificial intelligence in their algorithms and in the virtual patient-doctor assessments that they have. They will literally be looking at using computer vision and discerning whether the patient is confused or other dimensions. So everything will be measured. AI will be the most disruptive technology trend that we see for the next 3 to 5 years, and it's going to unlock a lot of value. It's better at gaming, whether it's four-person poker or AlphaGo or chess. We've seen that those are trivial use cases. It's better at detecting metastatic cancer, for example, than we are. It's better in many instances in language skills of translation and transcription. And so there's a lot of value. It's all around us at the moment. It's used in our everyday lives. And I don't think that the public actually understand that it's delivering a lot of value and is at the heart of things like basic things like spam filters or the ABS controls in our cars. So it is delivering a lot of value, but at the same time, the number one reason for the slower adoption of AI and technology has to do with this lack of trust in the technology and the data that is used to deliver this value, whether it's business value or societal value, and ideally both. I'd say that we have seen a lot of what you presented in terms of the results today. We've seen it in our own customer research, where 75% of people that we speak to are worried about the security of their personal data online, and about 83% of them wish it was easier to control how their personal data is shared with companies. And so dimensions of transparency and control, in addition to the points that were made earlier, I think are really, really important. The other point I would make is about there needs to be a value exchange. That I suspect that the reason some of those people that were very reluctant or sitting on the fence, had to do with their perception of a return in value, right? And so being really clear about what that exchange is, but also ensuring that it preserves, respects, and earns the trust that is underpinning that value exchange as well. So, I think there are a couple of things I would just say about how we BT think about it in this space. And our starting point is always about customer obsession and putting customers and people at the heart of our products and solutions. Being really clear about our purpose and having clear, responsible tech principles, accountability, openness, fairness. Those are all things that we fixate on. And also about, this is an ecosystem challenge and opportunity. And so how we interact with government, with regulators, with other companies, with civil society, with academia, and so on, is really, really fundamental to how we think about this. I was looking at a piece that one of my fellow UK AI Council members submitted, Martin Teen, on the MIT review this week, and he said there were 3 key things to fixate on. One was about transparency. The second was about the public right to offer meaningful input and to call on those in authority to justify the decisions that are being made, with our data and the algorithms that sit behind that. And then the third thing was really about the ability to enforce sanctions. So a lot of value. It's all around us at the moment, but trust and ethics and of course respect for privacy, needs to be maintained. And if we ensure that we have smart technology and smart people coming together, so it's the human and the algos that I would argue give us the best outcomes, and not either one of those in isolation.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Thanks to everybody who's participated in the polis. If you've done it, you can go back. There will be more statements ready, so you can carry on voting on those, and perhaps you'll have had a new idea prompted by Adrian or Shabira's remarks. Our final panelist, before I move to the Q&A, and if you do have questions, do please post them in the Q&A, or if you just like someone else's question, you can also upvote the questions, increasing the chances of us getting to them. But our final speaker is Dr. Miley Zameter, who is Head of Public Policy at the Open Data Institute. She's had roles at the Alan Turing Institute, the Royal Society, and has served on an advisory group at Chatham House. So another amazing expert to share her reflections with us. Milly.
Polly, thank you very much for the invitation today, and I really enjoyed your presentation, Josh, kind of introducing the report. I look forward to reading it in more detail myself later. So I just wanted to share some initial reflections on what was presented. So I really liked the kind of emphasis on being inclusive and empowering, but I think it's also important, while acknowledging the risks of discrimination or, digital technologies reinforcing existing discrimination, I think it's also really important to explore the ways in which the use of data and digital technologies might actually redress structural inequalities. So think of them as disruptors and perhaps disrupting the existing status quo. And I'd really like to see more exploration of that, more research around that, and more of the narrative around that being developed, rather than the automatic assumption, that they're going to reinforce, existing inequalities. Like I said, we should be aware of that risk and be mindful of it, but I'd also like to see the inverse explored a lot more. I also really agreed with the kind of emphasis on having specific and limited use cases for data. But one thing I'd like to highlight, and also to kind of highlight to attendees today, and I welcome discussion from the panel and from the audience, is, well, I think that the way that data is used and the way that digital technology can be used isn't going to be limited to one sector or one kind of data in the future. And we're going to have to get comfortable thinking across the silos that we already have now for the public interest and for the public good. So I'll give a couple of really practical examples in kind of aspects of pandemic response. So, traditionally we sort of, segregate health data and non-health data, and the governance and regulation around health data takes a certain form which doesn't apply to other forms of data. But here's a kind of counter example, right? So non-health data can be relevant to health. It can be relevant to public health. So think about the way that mobility data, how communities were moving around or not moving around in lockdown, that's going to impact public health. And that data is needed for public health interventions, but it's not health data, So there's the ways we categorize data now might not always kind of be the most relevant to how data can be used in the public good, right? So we're going to have to sort of think a bit differently across sectors and domains. And the other ways in which we're going to have to sort of think differently around sectors and domains is who's involved in kind of sharing data or analysing that data. So one of the projects that we were involved in at the ODI, we wanted to understand the impact of lockdowns and emergency homeschooling on children, but also on their parents, the families, the teachers, and not just the children themselves. So for that, we had to kind of work across sectors and domains. We worked with Mumsnet in order to kind of like analyze the data on a social media company's website, you know, about how parents were feeling or how they were reported to be feeling. We worked with Barnardo's, who was providing emergency support to families in some communities. We worked with open data sets from the Department for Education. So that's industry, that's a social media company, that's a civil society organization, that's public sector data. And by combining it, we also worked with MyEd, a teacher app, you know, for how teachers reporting how teachers were feeling and what they were struggling with. And we needed to do that to work across different kinds of data and different sectors to get that rounded picture. It also allowed us to be granular and to be timely, you know, whereas often kind of government data, it can take months to collect and verify. So there's that kind of thinking a bit differently about who's collecting the data, what data it's being combined with, and how that can be used in the public good. And I think we're going to need some of that kind of I guess that political literacy, both in data users and those who are governing data, in order to get the best outcome for populations and for communities. But that also is compatible with specific and limited use, but it just means thinking a bit differently. Finally, on the point about kind of enabling control, I think that's also really important. I'd say the flip side to that is kind of strengthening accountability. So maybe not so much about kind of enabling the control that individuals have, but strengthening institutional accountability to them about how their data is used. And there's different ways you can do that. So I'm thinking about, you know, so one of the kind of, you know, points that came up was trust in a technology. Well, one way that you can strengthen trust in a technology is by strengthening transparency. And so we call this open models, open analytics. The heart of this is kind of the principle of reproducibility in science, right? Can you reproduce your results? You do that by kind of reproducing the data, reproducing your method and letting other people scrutinize it. So transparency in science makes the science more trustworthy and kind of, you know, more rigorous. And we think the same thing should apply for data analysis, data collection, and the digital technology is built off the back of them. Open models, open analytics. And I think this approach would also help speak to kind of Shabira's point about inclusion and empowerment. So when you make your models open and your data open, it allows different people to participate in collaboration. They can adapt that data and that technology to suit their purpose and serve their community's needs. It allows different communities to participate in innovation. It lowers the barriers to participation in innovation, right? So you can get startups, SMEs that come from the community in a grassroots way, rather than only being the big tech firms. So that openness in the data and the models allows all sorts of different social outcomes too, not just the rigor of the technology. You can also try to strengthen trust in an institution, the institution that's using the data or collecting it. And again, that I think a way to do that is through transparency. So the open government model is quite an interesting example of this, because, you know, from the principles of open government, you get tools such as the freedom of information request, right? But then some kind of public sector authorities have gone further. So I think it's North Lanarkshire Council. They invested in kind of making sure that they published lots of data about what they were doing in order to preempt freedom of information requests, because they took the view that every freedom of information request, every FOI request was a sign of service failure, because it meant that their communities wanted to know something that they weren't telling them, right? So by trying to preempt that, by making the data open in advance, it reduced the number of FOI requests, therefore made them more accountable, strengthened democratic participation, allowed more innovation because people could access data more quickly, less administrative burden, you know, all sorts of things come from that. So I think it's not just about thinking about the control that people have, but the accountability to them, which will allow them to kind of be more empowered in a preemptive sort of way, if you see what I'm getting at. And then finally, I really like the point about data custodianship, and I was glad to see that emerging. So I think that trust in a use case, trust in how data is used, can be strengthened with co-design. You know, so rather than it being something that's happening in a top-down way or that's owned by a technocratic community, you try to co-design how the data is collected, how the data is analysed, and what that is used for. And so at the ODI, we call this data institutions, and they're organisations that maybe collect or steward data use on behalf of the community for others to use. These can be organisations set up for that purpose, or it could be existing organisations that can take on a bit of that responsibility around data management. So for example, trade unions already have lots of data about, say, professional communities, you know, and so they could maybe help, you know, kind of make sure that data is used in a way to serve the community that they represent. We at the ODI, we tend to say data institutions because that's, you know, there's a subset of data institutions that's fairly high profile. I'm wondering how Adrian's going to react to this. This is data trusts, right? There's been a lot of hype around what data trusts could do in terms of, you know, enabling AI, because it allowed data to be shared and linked to allow better kind of analysis and more rapid analysis. So, you know, data trusts are a really high profile example of data institutions. but it can also be more small scale, more community orientated, and so on. So I think that's different ways of thinking about that, kind of building that trust and that participation. I'll stop there, but there's lots to discuss. I'm really looking forward to Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you all. We've had a comment from Nigel King in the sidebar around how Polis works. And I just want to address that super quickly because it's such an important issue, is that what you see in the presentation is the way that Polis helps us to identify different groupings of opinion. And there's a danger if you just sort of settle with that and say, oh, we all hate each other, everyone disagrees. Woo. That's kind of not enough, is it? But what we do at Demos in terms of using Polis is to then, there's kind of phases of thinking here, is if you've drawn these big divided boxes and you separate people as far as possible, what then are the statements that still bridge those divides? What are the consensus building statements? And there've been examples of the use of Polis in kind of live decision making in Taiwan, for example, where it almost becomes a kind of game of who can identify those bridging statements. It may be that it's something that researchers do in the work we did about the post-COVID settlement for society called Renew Normal, where we had 50,000 participants. We absolutely were focused on identifying what are the bridges of empathy and consensus between a potentially divided society. This is one of those things with research, as Nigel says, it's not just about the findings, it's about what you do with them. And I do not want to become Shiva, the destroyer of worlds, but thank you for the question. I think it's really important. I mean, this is obviously just one tiny piece of data innovation, but it's always important to be transparent and open and discursive, I think, about what different methods do and what they imply about your value set and your judgments. The question which I accidentally clicked on answered, so sorry about that, which got the most votes, was this question of how do we include the relatively excluded people in discussions and also in the design of the internet, of data institutions? How do you make sure that you're reaching those voices most likely to be marginalized already and also at huge risk of being harmed or damaged or further marginalized by data or algorithms built without them? And I think there's also a question from Sean Mavundla, which I think is worth drawing in, which is how does epistemic injustice arise in the usage of data and how might this be prevented or minimized in the future? I think the two come together. It was originally your question, Shabira, a question to you. So Shabira, what can you say about inclusive design and research?
Well, I've just tried to answer the question on there. I've just added in a link to just a really short blog because I get asked this question a lot, just as some starters and just to frame what I mean by inclusive. What I mean when I talk about that is that our starting point is those communities most at risk of whatever exclusion, thinking about it from an intersectional perspective. So just to frame that. And, I stood up a program, 6-month program within NHSX to test and prove that even at a national level, you can invite the most seldom heard voices, the voices that some of us internally in health organizations call hard to reach. In my perspective, the hard to reach are the doctors. They're the hardest to actually get to participate in anything. They have been the hardest to reach for me for 20 years. And communities are there. So I think if you want to genuinely work with people, you need to start with the people. That's the first principle. You need to make sure that you build in time to not only listen, it's not good enough just to reach and get a whole lot of Black and brown people and go, yeah, well, I reached those people who experience racism. No, sorry, you're going to get people like me and maybe Adrian and maybe Millie. We're not talking about us. We're already in the conversation. We're talking about those people who are underneath the margins. And the only way you can do that is not going through your research companies and not just going to the national charities. I've run national charities. We have the same risk of reaching those marginalized, disenfranchised, easy to ignore communities as everybody else. You need to go to communities. You need to go to the community, the groups and the organizations that have been catching people for the last 12 months and before, the communities that we dream of reaching. So you go to the grassroots organizations and you work with them. You go to the community hubs, you go to those faith groups, you go wherever these people are at, because people live within community. No matter what Margaret Thatcher said in the 70s, there's no such thing as community. That's rubbish. I couldn't raise my kids as a single mum in East London if there wasn't a community. That's the fact, right? I need a community that keeps me and my kids safe. So when my son's going to school, he's safe. So we all live in community. You need to go to where people are at. You need to be creative. As Millie said, this is an opportunity to do positive disruption. So why wouldn't you? Why would you want to just keep going and doing research and saying, okay, I've done a piece of user research, and just hearing the same things over and over and over again? Why would any of us want to be doing that? This is an amazing time in our lives when we can, we can redress, as Millie said. So many things, like work can be amazing in this space, and we can meet some amazing people and hear their stories. So now you go to them, that's still not good enough. That's not inclusive. Just because you listen to them is not enough. Do not turn people into a tick box. We're talking about people's real lives. This is life and death. COVID just shown that. Yeah, Black Lives Matter movement in the last 12 months has shown us that. Yeah, we've just had Sasha getting shot, Sasha Johnson on Sunday. So this is people's real lives. So once you go to the people, then you need to create time to actively listen to people. And if you really want to do inclusive design and co-design and co-production at any level on that spectrum, whatever your budget and time allows, and whatever is appropriate for that particular piece of data or tech architecture that you're building, you need to then listen and you need to act on what you've heard, because this is about building trust. Yeah, we want people to share our data and, opt in and everything. Build trust. You can only build trust by doing the doing. Yeah, walk the walk. Don't just talk the talk and say we want to be inclusive. So you need to act on. And when you act on, you need to go back to people. So there needs to be this cycle of going back. So I ran this 4-month program. In 4 months, we ran over 300 one-to-one interviews in all sorts of community languages with communities who have been previously excluded and have actually experienced really high levels of digital exclusion. And they were run with and for people from these communities. So instead of a whole bunch of community researchers that were sitting in NHSX, we trained up in a 4-month period. We trained up community researchers that were from those communities. So already the trust was there, because then they had to trust us, and we worked with them to build those research questions. So we had the questions as researchers, and then we ran a session with them. So before we went to community, and they sense checked and they pushed back and they went, no, I can't go and ask that in Somali or whatever, in Romania, that's just not going to go down. And so we synthesized, and then we ran research challenges in an agile way. So we ran through loads. And so we did a whole piece of work on GP access during the pandemic, maternity access, mental health. Then they came up with questions. So it is possible. It is so possible to do it and still work in an agile way, working with can you get us 20 people in 10 days? All the time we got asked this, but because you go to people, you build trust. And what we would do is, once you hear and you're saying you're going to act upon, before we would publish any findings, we would go back to the cohort and we'd say, this is what we heard. So this is, so Josh would go back to the group and say, this is what we heard. These are the assumptions that we are making based on the data that you've given us. And we would corroborate that what we heard was what we thought we heard. And most of the time it was, because people are experienced and, we know what we're doing. Sometimes it wasn't. And so they'd be like, no, that's not actually what we meant. This is what we meant. And we were able to synthesize. And so then we published the results and we acted upon, and we went back and said, okay, so you said this to us and therefore this has happened. So you said this to us, so therefore we're not launching, for example, and this happened, we didn't launch the first COVID app last year at this time last year. It was supposed to be launched at the beginning of June. We didn't launch it because of what people have said. And it wasn't about the mainstream research we did with the researchers. It was the research that we did, the dedicated conversations that we had with people who weren't included in the research. And we were talking communities who experienced racism, particularly at that time, and all sorts of other exclusion. And so to do really inclusive, you need to go to where they're at, listen and build that listening in, and then check in. And you need to act on, because all those things build trust and they build resilience in these communities. And you know what else it does? It's that empowering thing that Josh was talking about. You can't empower people if you're not sharing power. Right. And so you need to be able to let it go. And that means that you need to be involved in making decisions, even about the way you're working, like, so setting those research questions. Yeah, you have all these assumptions, you need to check in with them.
Shabira, I I could listen to you talk about research methods literally all day.
No.
No, it's so inspiring and absolutely exciting. But I want to bring Millie and Adrian in, reflections on that, but also I guess the wider questions of the risks of perpetuating cycles of exclusion and discrimination through the use of AI, but also what the opportunities are to actually do it the other way and actually use technology to disrupt those cycles if we can. Millie, do you want to come first?
Yeah, thank you. Shabir, I really loved your comments, and just briefly on that. So earlier this year, we did a project with the Ada Lovelace Institute and with the Centre for Public Data on inclusive data itself, and I can post the link in chat. But as part of that, we got a case study from the Romani Cultural and Arts Company, which is an organisation run by people from the Gypsy, Romani and Traveller community for the Gypsy, Romani and Traveller community. And one thing that I thought that they're doing was really interesting was they have trained researchers from the community itself conducting the research, right? But they also ask different research questions, because they'll have different priorities than say maybe central government does, right? And actually that speaks to the point about kind of sharing power and deciding, well, whose priorities are reflected here and so on. So it's a complete kind of reversal of the power structures and the priorities. And for me, that's really, kind of authentic, inclusive co-design. And data institutions can help with that, because that's an example of a community collecting and stewarding data about themselves and deciding how it's used, and that gives them the agency over that. So I can share the link in chat. But on the kind of the disruptive point, which something that really inspires and motivates me. So I can give examples maybe from the context of international development. So what you're seeing in international development is there was a traditional assumption about how economic development would go, right? So, you kind of have an agricultural economy, and then you kind of move to an industrialized economy, and then you move to a digital economy. What we're seeing, certainly in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the global south, is you're getting a leapfrogging from agrarian economy to digital economy and hybrid, right? And they have a huge advantage, because the kind of infrastructures that we have in kind of industrialized countries are not necessarily suitable for digital tech and AI. And by leapfrogging that stage and going straight to digital, what they get is they can design the infrastructure that suits digital tech from the outset, right? So they have a huge advantage there. And that's the kind of thing I have in mind, right here in Britain, thinking about communities that might now be structurally disadvantaged. Think about the ways they can adapt the technology to suit them, or the ways that the ways that they have been excluded from existing kind of, infrastructure and so on, how that might be harnessed or yoked to actually serve as a kind of strategic advantage when we think about use cases for digital tech. That's what I'd like to see more of. I'll post a link to our inclusive data work in chat.
Thank you. Adrian, how does BT and also, I guess, the AI Council see these risks?
I could also listen to Shabira and Millie, for forever, right? When I think about bias, and we've seen a lot of bias in algorithms, gender bias, ethnic diversity biases, and so on. Even the GCSE results last year, right, and the algorithms that were used there. I would say a couple of things. One is, when I think about bias, there are three levels of bias I think about. The first one is bias in the data. And our data sets actually, representative. Two is bias in the algorithms, and that's something that we need to be fixate on a lot, and the governance of algorithms, and not just in the moment, but over time. And the third one is bias in the people that are building these algorithms. And I would argue that quite a lot of the time, what we believe to be a bias in the algorithm is actually a fundamental bias in the data. And I'd also argue, as people like Joy Bourlami, who is a professor at MIT, you should look her up and what she's done in creating the Algorithmic Justice League. She's also a poet, by the way. Do listen to her. Is that if we had more people from the populations that are being treated in these ways, involved in coding, involved in building these algorithms, that we would have a lot less of these outcomes. I'm also intrigued by the idea of how we can use the tech, right, to improve inclusion and diversity, for example, or fairness. So things like a product that IBM created called IBM Faces that look at a data set of faces and discern whether or not there is any potential bias in that data set. Or tools that we can use, for example, if we're putting job descriptions out, there's a tool that we will use that will tell us whether or not it feels like it is a more male biased job description, for example. Or tools that Unilever and others are using in the recruitment process, where they use 3 algorithms before you even get to meet a person in the recruitment process. Well, guess what? It was more efficient. We expected that, but it also delivered much better diversity than they had achieved previously. So I'm really excited about how we can use some of the tech to solve for some of the issues that the questions are posing.
Fantastic, thank you. Hilary Sutcliffe has posed an interesting question specifically about the Biometrics and Surveillance Commissioner, but I wonder if I can just open that out to think about what is the role that regulators should play here. Should we be more aggressive? Should it be more flexible? I wonder is this something where business can be expected to lead and should be trusted to do so, or should there be more a different role for the regulator? Adrian, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, just very briefly, and then I'd love to hear from the other panelists. So we've seen frameworks, right, from the EU, from 40 different countries, the UK, around the ethical and trustworthy use of data and AI. And so there are 7 principles, right, that you could broadly look at around fairness and transparency and all the things that you'd expect. I think it is we're now seeing a move towards turning some of those frameworks and policies into regulation, and I think we're going to see more of that. That we do look. I mean, I know one of the things in an AI Council context, so looking at the UK, how do we stay at the forefront of AI, as we are? And one of the areas where we really believe that we can lead on is around ethical and trustworthy use of data and AI. And part of that, I believe, will be around a regulatory framework that is setting and enforcing standards for safe and ethical and development and deployment. But we may also think about having a unit that is looking at failures in the use of ethical and trustworthy principles around data and AI and so forth, where they maybe have sector-specific regulations and focus. So I think we're going to see more, in short, around regulation, and it may well be required if we don't see organizations moving much faster to the principles that have been very clearly outlined.
Millie.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, no, the role of regulators is really both important and also really interesting. And one of the projects I was involved in at the Turing was working with patient data, right, health data. And it was shortly after the kind of, the Google DeepMind Royal Free scandal, and when the ICO kind of had to come down and say, well, actually, that's not an appropriate use of kind of patient data. And so then we thought, well, what do we do with our project? We were going to work with NHS Scotland. We thought, do we shrink back because there'll be a kind of loss of public trust? But that's going to affect the future of medical research, right? And then we looked at the ICO statement, and what she said is, privacy and innovation can coexist, right? And in fact, they have to. And we thought, no, they don't want to chill research. They don't want to chill innovation. They just want it to be done ethically, with proper accountability. So rather than shrinking back and reducing our project, we expanded it, right? We expanded it, but we made sure that the governance was really robust and that we had a really kind of strong business case for the operational benefits, for the patient outcomes. We just did a really good application, and we got access to an unprecedented amount of patient records, right? So that's exactly, I think it's kind of, regulators don't necessarily want to kind of freeze innovation. They just want it to be done in ways that are kind of compliant and so on. So it's kind of making sure that message is communicated, but also making sure regulators themselves are comfortable occupying that space. And particularly we find that with data, because it's all so new and fast changing, they can become risk averse, and in that way maybe miss opportunities to get a good outcome for the population, for society and so on, not just for business, but we need to also think about citizens and consumers and getting good outcomes for them too, and the role of regulators of that. So I think that, one argument that I find quite interesting is that, data that's been generated by people, well then, and, in some cases paid for, through taxes, maybe there's a kind of duty to make sure that's used in the public interest. And maybe that would change the burden of kind of, expectations and so on things like regulators and government departments. If you think about this, citizen generated data as being something they have an obligation to make sure is used in the public interest, maybe that would change some of the calculations and the kind of, maybe some missed opportunities because of risk aversion. I'll post one of our projects about this in chat, but it's a really fascinating topic.
Thank you. Shabira, any thoughts on that? And just to attendees, now is your final chance to post anything in the polis. After Shabira has spoken, I'm going to turn to Josh to tell us what we all think. Adrian, I'm afraid, has to leave us just before the end, but a BT colleague, Andy Wells, is going to be wrapping up for us. But Andy, thank you. Adrian, sorry, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing such interesting thoughts. Shabira, thoughts on regulators?
Yeah, not any more than just to build on what Adrian and Millie have said. I think it is an opportunity to democratize access to data. And I've been an advocate of, this is people's data, is done with public money. And we have not just a public responsibility, but a moral imperative to be able to do that. I personally believe as well. The only other thing I would say is that it's more enriching, this conversation, if it's not just had in a silo, like just as regulators and actually if we have really diverse spaces to be able to tackle this. I mean, just hear what Adrian and Millie have said, and that's like two different sectors coming together. And I think if we have a much more collaborative approach to thinking through these big problems from our particular domains and have these multiple perspectives in the room, then I think we can have governance and regulation that is fit for purpose, rather than just like, I'm scared because we've never been here as humans before and I'm worried and I'm scared of the implications, and instead like own that fear, own those risks. And again, that positive disruption that Millie got us and got me excited about is the only thing I'd build on.
Fantastic, really helpful, thank you. I'm going to turn to Josh to just highlight some of the interesting statements from Polis. One of the Polis is a really fascinating piece of technology, partly because, as I mentioned before, you can kind of use it at different stages of your sort of design diamond, if you know what I mean, when you're trying to expand your thinking and also when you're trying to crystallize around consensus statements. And here we're kind of using it, as we have with other clients as well, as a kind of collective intelligence network, trying to really source challenging, new and difficult ideas, and then just do that first initial bit of testing of those ideas as well. Because, one of the challenges, as I'm sure anybody who's ever put a poll into the field will know, or any kind of survey, is usually you get the results back and it's only then that you think of some extra questions you should have asked. And what we love about Polis is it helps to enable everybody to participate and broaden your understanding of what you should be asking in the first place through the process. So thinking of it that way, as the collective intelligence, challenges and wisdom of the people who've been with us today. Josh, over to you.
So yes, thank you to everyone who has been voting and responding to some of the points raised during this discussion, and it's been a really vital discussion, I think. Thank you also to the person who has tested our moderation team by putting a load of kisses in the submission box. That was really nice. But we're seeing a real range of discussion going on here, particularly picking up Shabira on some of your points around digital technologies and the potential to redress and not just reinforce existing inequalities, which I think is a really valid response to some of the findings that we showed at the beginning of this discussion. We've seen people suggesting that we need to continue to invest in and develop AI because, look, it's better than humans. Lots of things showing that, look, there is positivity around tech as well as a warning to be sounded here. People have raised the old question about whether we should be looking at subscription models for things like social media companies, rather than that being based on value extracted from use of data. So that conversation is going on. And we've in echoing our findings that people are asking for more control over how their data is being used, a few different statements have concentrated around this idea that you should always be able to see what data has been used to make decisions about you and your life and where that data comes from. We've seen people expressing a wish for that. And this idea of the individual opt-outs. This is probably my favorite statement actually in submitted discussion so far, that individual opt-outs aren't enough when harm could come from everyone else sharing data that feeds into the algorithm. And if I can abuse my position here for a second, I'm really interested to see, to put that back to the panel to ask whether actually doing this on an individual basis is enough, or whether we need a kind of group opt-out, a way of talking about how different communities experience technology and taking their wishes into account.
Yeah, Millie and Shabira, before we close, how do we, I think it's, I don't remember where I read, good article, I think from Luminate about this challenge, that sometimes the individuals has power, but it's collective harm that's being caused. Do you have any reflections on how we can meet that challenge?
Yeah, I think, is that the new article by Martin Tisney that came out this
Yes,
week?
Martin Tisney, that's the one.
Yes, on collective rights, yes. I mean, so one thing that we think at the ODI is that, GDPR was really great, and that as the UK has now left the EU, we should think about not undermining it, but rather building on it. But one notable gap in GDPR, right, is that it only speaks about individual data rights and individual kind of harms and benefits. And actually exactly that, we need to think about group rights, group harms, but also kind of group benefits such as the environmental good or public health good and so on. So it's not just about, I might be affected by other people opting in and out, but also collectively maybe we have certain responsibilities to the environment or so on, and therefore an obligation for our data to be used in that way. But exactly, thinking about group rights is going to be key.
Yeah, well, the vaccine's given us the vaccine gives us a good example of where we've had to really mobilize as a whole community in the UK about how we tackle it. So I ran a piece of research in August, just testing out in these grassroots communities to test out people's views about taking the flu vaccine. So this is before we had the COVID vaccine, but we were like nearly on there, and we were feeding into the COVID vaccine pathway. And the cohort, over like a 3-hour period, we had 50 people complete this really short survey. And what it said is everyone in the survey were people who would describe themselves as people from communities who experience racism. I don't use the term BME, so this is the term I'm using in exchange. Most of them, so like 90% of those people had taken the flu vaccine in the past, and nearly all of them had a long-term health condition, so they qualified. There were people who, as a public health system, we want them to take the flu vaccine, and particularly we wanted people to take the flu vaccine in September because of the second wave of COVID was imminent, and it was seen as a way of supporting the NHS at that time. And people were like, no, and it was very much from an individual perspective, people were thinking about no. And so that data was very much grounded in people's own experiences. And then that was a good trend to look at how people were thinking about the COVID vaccine. And at that time in September, people's views were very much like that. Going down into that second lockdown in December, January time, people had to start thinking not just then about themselves and about the implications of the choices they're making for themselves, but actually in the wider community. And what we saw is the trend reverse. So the same communities when we went back to, and we went pretty much back to the same 50 people plus, had shifted their views. And it was about the information, the quality of information we have, and how you provide that information. If you're providing it at an individual level versus at a community level, and you're not hooking back into community, then you're going to have an individual response. You're going to have me and my kids only want this, and I don't care about what my neighbors want. I'm building this really big wall, or I'm going to keep all my rubbish outside. I'm not, whatever, right? Like I'm thinking about me, or am I getting information that's more at a community level and tying into those community bonds. And so I think data is just an escalation of that. And I think COVID's given us a really good example of that. You can tie it into that, and people are prepared to think about it in that way, and they have the skills within their own lives to be able to do that. We're very skillful. We're much more skillful at that level than we give people credit for.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to turn to Andy Wales for some if I can make my computer work, for some final remarks. Andy is the Chief Digital Impact and Sustainability Officer at BT, and we've been working with him on this project. Andy.
Thank you, Polly, and thank you, everyone. It's been an amazing hour, actually. It's been fascinating. I've got a number of devices here in my team across BT who work on integrating digital impact and sustainability. I've been firing ideas from Millie and Shabir and others all the way through. So I was off camera quite a lot there, kind of process them all. I think, look, it's been fascinating, particularly because we're the team at BT. It essentially helps us think, how do we make this practical as we develop, buy, use and sell technology with partners, with a whole range of different customers, from consumers all the way through to big multinationals and SMEs in the middle. How do we make it practical? And I think the crisis of trust, which has been explored a bit more through the research, I think in a really interesting way, about not just a question of how much people can trust companies, but also how much they feel trusted and empowered by companies to be able to manage their own data, their own information, I think is fundamental. And I think the segmentation, the kind of concern, the nonchalant, the conflicted, is really interesting and helpful. But I really take the challenge that there's two risks with that. One is that it then starts to divide, not unify. And second is you need to go many layers down to really get to the understanding of different groups and what it means for them. And two of the things I really took away from the comments here, one was Shabira's point around making your engagement with individuals and as part of communities simple, precise, and focus on what people really worry about. And then Millie's point about, and then looking at the opportunity there. What's the opportunity to leapfrog generations of technology, to look at solutions for them? And as a company that's developing products and services all the time, with EE and our other brands around the UK and internationally, the pace of change is so fast, particularly in the context of COVID and what people need and how we enable people to get the most out of the world. That then integrating some of these tensions into our thinking about product development and customer communications is both difficult but critical. And so I think that's why this has been a super helpful panel to help us think more about that. We've last year launched a new responsible tech approach that Adrian and his team and others are a big part of, which has principles like for good, accountable, fair, and open. But the real trick to those is then getting everyone in the organization, particularly those developing and selling products and services, to understand what they mean and live them in a very fast changing environment. And I think to be able to do that, the only way we can do that is to listen and learn as much as we can. And that's why conversations like this are absolutely fundamental. So thank you very much from us to Demos and all of the speakers. And we're going to take forward these conversations, obviously key into many others that are going on already. And we'd appreciate in particular your challenge, because that's when we can learn and do things differently. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. And thank you to everybody for participating. It's our first attempt to use Polis live through an event. And we've really enjoyed your input from that. And the questions, I'm sorry that we couldn't get to them all. If you're interested in partnering with Demos to explore public opinion or public policy, this is the kind of thing that we do. We would love to hear from you. We are really interested in finding ways and building new technology. It's why we have Josh, our CTO, building technology to help us engage in the complexity of lived experience, the complexity of public values, and really bring the public into public policy so that we can build consensus across a potentially otherwise divided society. So please do get in touch with me or with Josh or anyone else in the team. And thank you again to BT, to Millie, to Shabira, and of course to Adrian, who is no longer with us. And we hope that you will stay in touch with us and future work. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.